everybody. Thank you once again for joining us for the first public debate of the semester. Very exciting. Like, I can hear the whoops. For those of you who may not be familiar with what Speech and Debate is, we are an organization that is funded by student government, where students go ahead to practice their writing skills, public speaking skills, argumentation skills, all that good stuff. And as you can see, the resolution for tonight's debate is the United States federal government should continue to criminalize all illicit drugs. For those of you who are not familiar with the structure of public debates, these are the type of speeches and how it usually goes. So the resolution, which you just saw, is the proposition that is subject to debate, or the one that we're debating. The affirmation will be the first team to go, and they argue in support of the resolution, and the negation argues against it. There are two types of speeches you're going to be seeing here tonight. The first is an introduction or constructive speech, which essentially lays out all of the points for that team's argument. And then you have the rebuttal speech, which is why the other team's argument is wrong. Just a little helpful order of speeches for you. First, you're going to be seeing our affirmation, Gillen, then our negation, Ben, then our affirmation again, Gillen, and then our negation again, Ben. It is a 1v1, very exciting for us. Just a couple of definitions, because this resolution is a bit confusing. Criminalize, as you can see, is to make an activity illegal. I don't know if you want me to read this whole dense paragraph here. It is essentially explaining the difference between decriminalize and legalize. Decriminalize means removing any criminal penalties from a crime, and legalize means removing all penalties from the crime. And then, of course, illicit means for something to be forbidden by law. Just a couple of reminders for all of you before we begin. Zoomers, please keep your cameras off and microphones muted. As you can see, we have a giant screen where you might appear during the debate if you happen to speak. So no one wants that. Please follow the instructions. For all of you, there will be an audience poll at the end, and we encourage guests who are not judging or debating to stick around and vote. This one is very important for loved ones, professors, classmates, the Drug Enforcement Administration. If you're out there, just keep in mind that debaters will be arguing points that they may not necessarily believe in. What they're doing is mostly a demonstration of, writing skills, performance skills, not necessarily a reflection of their personal beliefs. Once the debaters finish speaking, judges will have 5 minutes to private message or hand their decisions to me. Those of you who are here, I will give you pieces of paper, so you don't have to worry about that. And after that, I will ask you to elaborate on your decisions. For those of you who are here for class credit, as I put in the chat earlier, there will be a Google form going out at the end, so you can put your name in that, and we'll be sure you get your credit. But with all of that out of the way, I will introduce the debaters. On the affirmation, we have Gillen Manos over here. And then on the negation, we have the guy you just saw behind me named Ben Davis. Yeah, but with all of that out of the way, I will hand it over to them. Once again, thank you, and I hope you enjoy.
All right, is my audio good? Everyone can hear through the mic?
Someone said a little bit low. Why don't you try speaking at normal volume?
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Better.
You good?
Go ahead.
All right. Are the judges ready? All right, then I shall begin. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed judges. I stand before you tonight in firm affirmation of the resolution that the United States federal government should continue to criminalize all illicit drugs. I would first like to state that though there is clearly room for policy reform in some areas, carte blanche decriminalization is not wise. The case for continuing current policies is clear. First, decriminalization is bound to make current drugs more accessible and tempting, leading to increased harm. Second, there are many ancillary crimes associated with drug use, the frequency of which would increase if the legalization of currently controlled substances went forward. Third, and most importantly, decriminalization would be a boon to drug cartels. Now, to the details. My first contention is that legalizing drug use would lead to increased harm as more people would try illicit drugs. Now, many people compare illicit drugs like cocaine and psychedelics to legal drugs like tobacco and alcohol. After all, they say, society allows these substances to be consumed. even though they can be abused. Why not make other substances equally available? Simple. Availability is the mother of use. To quote an article from the National Institutes of Health, quote, the United States has some 60 million smokers, up to 20 million alcoholics, but only around 6 million illegal drug users. If illegal drugs were easier to obtain, this figure would rise, end quote. Simply put, more availability of drugs would lead to increased abuse and harms, especially on the part of children who do not possess the decision-making capacity necessary to decide to try alcohol, tobacco, or any other illicit substance. Now, one might argue that making it easier for people to access a substance does not guarantee that people will use or abuse that substance more. To them, I say, Great Britain, 2005. Pubs are allowed to lengthen their operating hours, some to even 24 hours a day, in an attempt to curb binge drinking. The result, again quoting the NIH, quote, a sharp increase in crime between 3 and 6 a.m., in violent crimes in certain pubs, and in emergency treatment for alcohol misusers, end quote. Increased availability of potentially harmful substances means increased harm, plain and simple. My second contention is that drug-related crime would increase with the decriminalization of controlled substances. The fact is that most drugs were not made illegal simply because the government didn't want people to have a good time. They were made illegal because they cause great harm to individuals and society. There's a reason dentists don't prescribe cocaine tooth drops anymore. According to the Department of Justice, quote, illegal drugs increase crime, partly because some users turn to crime to pay for their habits, and partly because some users are stimulated by certain drugs to act more violently, end quote. It may be perfectly legal for someone to do cocaine in the privacy of their home, or to take mushrooms as long as they aren't operating heavy machinery. It's all fun and games until, unable to afford his weekly line, a man decides to mug an innocent bystander. Or until a young man, high on a bad trip, tries to drive himself to the ER and takes a quick detour onto the sidewalk. My third and final contention centers around the drug cartels, described by the Department of Justice as, quote, some of the most dangerous transnational criminal organizations in the world, end quote. These gangs are responsible for tens of thousands of brutal murders each year. They deal in cocaine, marijuana, and opiates like heroin and fentanyl. Their annual revenues are estimated at up to $29 billion each year by the Department of Homeland Security. Any increase in drug availability and a relaxation of drug prosecution serves the interests of these gangs. According to the Drug Enforcement Agency, many cartels operate illicitly throughout states where marijuana has already been legalized, growing more potent strains of marijuana for sale on the black market. These more dangerous strains, often contaminated with dangerous chemicals or other drugs, especially target teens who are not able to legally purchase marijuana regardless of whether it's legal for the adult population. Many of these gangs operate these illicit grows alongside other criminal activities, such as international money laundering, fraud, and other drug production. Several such groves have also been discovered alongside illicit fentanyl pill operations. Every penny these cartels earn is pumped right back into their criminal enterprise. These funds fund bribery, murder, and human trafficking. A 2019 New York Times report documented migrant women and girls are at the mercy of cartels who control access to the Mexican side of the US border through their drug trade. These women are beaten, coerced into prostitution, made addicted to drugs, and routinely assaulted by cartel smugglers. The operations of these cartel smuggling networks are directly funded by the sale of illicit drugs in the United States, and such sales would clearly increase if criminal penalties were relaxed. Now, there are some modifications that could be made to current drug policy. Addiction is increasingly recognized as a physical and psychological disease, rather than a moral failure. Federal law could recognize these developments, giving judges slightly more leeway in sentencing and patients more leeway in treatment. Social service programs can be tailored to getting addicts the help they need, and educational efforts to effectively communicate the hazards of drug use to minors. As the NIH proposed, why not treat drug offenses among teens as analogous to non-harmful drunk driving, with the arrest serving as an opportunity to require the teenager to be screened and undertake any needed treatment. To conclude, although there are many areas where drug policy could be brought into the modern era and revised, the decriminalization wholesale of U.S. drugs of illicit drugs by the U.S. federal government would lead to an increased number of addicts and abusers, increased crime, and increased profits for international cartels. Thank you.
Please don't.
Don't? Okay. Cool. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Davis, and I'm here to explain why I stand firm negation of the resolution that the United States federal government should continue to criminalize all illicit drugs. So, for the sake of simplicity, I'm arguing that the federal government should not criminalize all illicit drugs. I will begin my argument this evening by laying out my 3 points that my argument is based upon. 1. The criminalization of drugs, like marijuana, is based on century-old, racially biased propaganda, filling our prisons with people who are not a harm to society. 2. Legalizing and supervising the market of some drugs would generate massive amounts of tax revenue for the government to put towards other programs that would benefit society. And 3. The decriminalization of these drugs could actually make them safer and more legal. Now, before I begin my argument, I would like to clarify that I am not arguing for the legalization of all illicit drugs. Some drugs, like heroin or cocaine, for example, would not benefit society through legalization. But according to Florida Statute 893.135, the current mandatory minimum for possession of between 4 and 14 grams of heroin is imprisonment of 3 years and a $50,000 fine. Now I ask this, how is this punishment supposed to rehabilitate the individual? This person is most likely already struggling, and to lock them away for years and financially burden them is clearly the wrong way to go about it. Now, on to my first point. The criminalization of drugs, like marijuana, is based on racial bias and is currently flooding prisons. According to Gallup data in 2020, in the United States, 76% of Democrats, 68% of independents, and 51% of Republicans favor legalization of marijuana. This shows that the majority of the nation favors legalization already, which means that the current criminalization of these offenders signifies the failure of our democratic system itself. And in the 1930s, a man by the name of Harry Anslinger, who was the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, took the scientifically unsupported data that marijuana is a violence-inducing drug, connected it to Black and Hispanic individuals, and created a perfect package of terror to sell to the American media public. This sense of fear and despicable racial bias is the reason that drugs like these are still illegal. Furthermore, the current system of criminalization is harming our citizens on a daily basis. You may want to brace yourself because I'm about to say a lot of math and numbers. According to PewResearch.org, in 2018, over 608,000 arrests were made solely off of marijuana possession. And according to the NJJN, an arrest for a simple charge like this costs an average of $3,000. This means that upwards of $1.8 billion are spent just on marijuana-related arrests annually. Additionally, the average cost to house an inmate is $35,000 a year, which, when multiplied by the $40,000 current inmates for legal-related charges, totals to $1.4 billion. This means that the police dedicate over $3.2 billion a year just to enforce laws against a harmless drug. Additionally, according to data from the NYPD, 94% of marijuana-related arrests in New York were people of color. And according to the WPR, in many U.S. cities, people of color are over 30 times more likely to be arrested for possession of weed than white individuals. Additionally, after these people serve their sentences, it's difficult for them to integrate into society again. This ultimately displays that the continued criminalization of these drugs is not only costing the U.S. billions of dollars, but is also harming countless people in our nation. On to my second point, taxing the market for some of these currently illegal drugs could help our economy and social welfare even more. According to federal statistics, over 40% of the U.S. population over the age of 12 has already tried marijuana. And according to the Washington Post, over 55 million adults in the U.S. actively use marijuana. Yet, almost none of this is able to be taxed due to the product being illegal in those states. According to Bill Pay, last spring, more than 300 economists signed a petition to support a paper by Harvard economist Jeffrey Meyer, who argued that the government could save $7.7 billion a year by not having to enforce marijuana prohibition. The report also found that taxing pot at rates comparable to those levied on tobacco and alcohol could raise $6.2 billion annually. That's a total of $13.9 billion in saving income, if we were able to collect on those taxes. And according to the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, cannabis taxes could generate over $106 billion and create 1 million jobs by 2025. These numbers are extraordinary and show how much our society can benefit from legalizing marijuana. The massive amount of money can be put towards so many other programs to assist living conditions across the country and make new jobs and opportunities for millions of Americans, and could also be put towards helping the minority groups that these unjust laws have harmed for so long. Lastly, the legalization of some drugs could actually help safeguard the nation. One way is by reducing the amount of lacing and unregulated drug manufacturing. Currently, there are no restrictions on formation of many drugs. According to the CDC, hundreds of people die every day from laced drugs. If the federal government were to legalize innocuous drugs like LSD and marijuana, these deaths from unsafely made drugs would reduce. Additionally, the black market around these drugs would reduce as well. Because some of these drugs would now be able to be purchased and manufactured legally and safely through the open market, cartels and syndicates would lose their footing. Overall, the war on drugs is harming our nation in a plethora of ways. The continued criminalization of all drugs criminalizes peaceful people because of antiquated biases, which can mentally harm them as well as make it difficult to live their life after these sentences are served to being perceived as a harmful criminal. Additionally, the money spent on fighting the war on drugs is causing taxpayer money to be diverted from far more important policies like education and healthcare. I implore you to see the positive change that can come from decriminalization of some of these substances, and I hope that tonight you cast your vote to support innovation. Thank you.
All right, audience, if you can do me a favor, does this sound better than it did before? This microphone is better? It is closer to my face as well. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed judges. My opponent does make some valid points. However, his case is largely based on faulty statistics and common misconceptions. I will now explain these flaws in detail. My opponent first tries to cover himself by claiming he only wants to decriminalize soft drugs, but sentences for possession of drugs like heroin are just too long. It's more important to focus on helping people than punishing them. I respond to this by directing your attention towards the great nation of Italy, which decriminalized heroin possession in an attempt to help rather than punish addicts. Italy now has the highest rate of heroin addiction in Europe, and heroin is no recreational drug. It kills. Now, whatever my opponent claims, the simple fact is that reducing criminal penalties for any drug leads to increased use, abuse, and harm. This fact has been clearly proven worldwide. My opponent then moves on to the common trope of the poor, innocent pothead thrown in jail for simple possession of marijuana. He goes on to cite various statistics showing how rampant this problem is. The fact is that this problem is a myth. First of all, 40,000 is nowhere near the actual number of inmates in prison for simple possession. The phrase marijuana-related charges is often used to inflate the number of people supposedly unjustly imprisoned. Carnegie Mellon's Jonathan Calkins found that more than 85% of people in prison for all drug law violations were clearly involved in drug distribution, and that only about 0.5% of the total prison population, 0.5%, were in for marijuana possession. Furthermore, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, quote, more than 99% of federal drug offenders are sentenced for drug trafficking, end quote. The actual number of people sentenced for marijuana possession federally in 2017, 92. Out of a total of nearly 20,000 drug convictions, out of a total of nearly 20,000 drug convictions, these statistics clearly show that all but a minuscule handful of prisoners are incarcerated for drug trafficking, not just possession, as my opponent would have you believe. Trafficking is far more severe as an offense because not only are the funds often linked to other more violent crimes, as I mentioned in my previous contention, but new people are being exposed to and addicted to potentially harmful substances. My opponent also cites the massive cost to the courts for marijuana charges. His statistics here are also highly misleading. Not only does he round up the cost per case by nearly $400, but he neglects to mention that this cost is only for juvenile cases in Baltimore County, Maryland. His inflated number is so specific as to be irrelevant to a discussion of national policy. My opponent's next claim is that the federal government would make a fortune off of taxing legalized drugs. There are several flaws with this argument. The most prominent being that the government could only tax legally sold drugs. Take, for example, California, which legalized marijuana within the last decade. Law enforcement agents estimate that over 80% of the marijuana sold in California is sold illegally, even though the state created a legal market with taxes that it could then profit off of. Sellers and buyers continue to utilize the more dangerous black market. They use this market to skirt government taxes and regulations. So although the government could theoretically tax any drug it decriminalized, that would just mean that sellers would continue to sell illegally to avoid the extra cost. There's no reason to think they wouldn't. Clearly, they don't mind breaking the law. Furthermore, the reason that the government taxes other controlled substances like alcohol and tobacco is to disincentivize their use. By that logic, it isn't reasonable to make harmful substances legal just because the government could hypothetically make money off of it. As I already proved in my case, increased availability of drugs leads to increased use, abuse, and harm. This means that a substantial percentage of the revenue the government would hypothetically raise off of drug taxes would have to go right back into treating addicts. My opponent's final argument is that decriminalizing these drugs federally would mean that they could be distributed safely, regulated for purity and potency. He is incorrect. I just told you about the massive market share of illegally grown drugs in California. Imagine this nationwide. The fact is that government oversight and taxes create increased costs for businesses. Cost drug manufacturers like the cartels would be more than happy to ignore. It is obvious that current illegal suppliers would not accept the increased costs and difficulty of doing business associated with operating legally when they're already content to sell their drugs illegally and avoid any potential costs. So although the idea of a safer supply sounds good in theory, in practice, there is no evidence that it would materialize. Now, I have conclusively shown that the reversal of drug policy would do vastly more harm than good. Worldwide evidence clearly shows that increased availability via decriminalization leads to increased harms by and usage of illicit drugs. Furthermore, drug-related crime will increase significantly with the decriminalization of illicit drugs. Drugs are an expensive habit, and evidence has shown that people tend to fund that habit with crimes. I also ask you to think of the tens of thousands killed or injured each year by the drug cartels. Cartels that would profit immeasurably off the decriminalization of drugs and the increased ease of doing business that decriminalization would bring. Evidence from California shows that a massive illegal drug market continues even with the decriminalization of drugs like marijuana, and that drug cartels use this market to fund human trafficking and other egregious crimes. My opponent's case against the continuance of criminalization is based almost entirely upon faulty, inflated statistics and inaccurate assumptions. He completely ignores the harms done by illicit drugs and those who push them, largely to poorer Americans. It is for these reasons that I ask you, for the good of the people, vote for the affirmation tonight. Thank you.
Is it okay with y'all? Just want to make sure. Hello again, everyone. After previously laying out the facts supporting my points of contention, I will now strengthen my argument by rebutting the points of the affirmation. My opponent's first point is that legalizing drugs would lead to increased harm due to more people trying illicit drugs. But according to J.Q. Wilson from the U.S. Department of Justice, quote, legalization will not affect addiction and its effects on the propensity to violence. Even representatives currently employed in the federal government dispel the fear tactics towards drug use by the affirmation. Better treatment, education, and research are used to curb dependency on drugs, and legalization will help that occur through better research and funding. Currently, the federal government sees drug users as a threat, not as human beings in need of help. Our system locks them up and isolates them from society. The position that the affirmation has, this twisted view that drug users are some sort of monsters to be feared, magnifies the root of the problems surrounding drug addiction. By legalizing some of these non-harmful drugs, we can turn to helping and rehabilitating people rather than criminalizing and harming them. My opponent's second point is that drug-related crime would increase with the decriminalization of controlled substances, and this is blatantly false. For example, according to Attorney Hakimi, Portugal recently decriminalized small amounts of many currently illicit drugs. Now, according to my opponent, this nation would have fallen apart due to rampant crime. But the nation has not collapsed, and its cities are not now overrun with drug addicts. In fact, the overall consumption of recreational drugs has declined. Overall illicit drug consumption among 16 to 18-year-olds has also dropped. Portugal has already done what I, the negation, is arguing for, and it worked. Thus, proving my opposition's point totally no. This confirms that non-harmful drugs that are illegal based on racially biased propaganda should be decriminalized to reduce crime and overall arrests on unarmed citizens. My opponent then tries to tie in use of cocaine and other hard drugs to the scary story of spark fear in argument, but I never mentioned legalizing cocaine or any hard drugs in my argument. Again, I'm arguing that the government should decriminalize certain non-harmful drugs, not legalize all of them. The affirmation continuously brings up how decriminalizing drugs like heroin can be dangerous, but I explicitly stated in my argument that I am not in favor of this. My opponent's final point is that the prevalence of drug cartels would increase with the decriminalization of marijuana. The affirmation characterizes cartels as dangerous and harmful, and he's absolutely correct. As we all know, cartels exist to serve the illegal market. The affirmation views on drug policy are what is causing these issues with cartels. There are no cartels for things like alcohol because our government currently regulates production and distribution of these products. Cartels only function in the illegal market, so if their government chose to further increase criminal penalties for marijuana possession, there would be an even higher demand for illegal drugs, causing cartels to gain even more power. This proves the affirmation's entire third point. Additionally, according to CNBC, Mexico Senate is currently already voting in favor for a bill to legalize the recreational use of marijuana in a bid to choke off black market production, further proving that the continued criminalization would only make the issue of cartels worse. The affirmation concludes this point by stating the quote, the operations of these cartel smuggling networks is funded largely by the sale of illicit drugs, proving his own point now. Our nation is in a crisis. The war on drugs has been draining our country for far too long. According to the CNBC, the U.S. has spent over $1 trillion on the war on drugs. This $1 trillion has been weaponized to defraud minorities based on unjust drug laws. This $1 trillion has been diverted from countless schools, hospitals, rehabilitation programs, therapy, and more. This $1 trillion is a physical manifestation of how our federal government prioritizes this war on drugs over the welfare of its own citizens. This cyclical cycle of punishment is obviously not working. So for the affirmation to argue that this criminalization needs to continue after 50 years of fighting with no ground game is a testament to why our nation is stuck. The affirmation would like you to believe that I am arguing for the legalization of harmful drugs like heroin and cocaine, but I'm not. The affirmation used these data points as a fear tactic to draw away from the fact that it is proven by countless sources that marijuana is, by research standards, not a harmful drug. Excuse me. And as I stated earlier, it is proven that the criminalization of weed was purely political and racially biased. I intend to argue for a policy that can help these individuals to recover from the decimation that the war on drugs has continued, that has been thrust upon them. I hope you all can see that the money wasted on fighting tired fights is hurting our nation, and that through the decriminalization of certain drugs, we can begin to rebuild what we have lost. Thank you.
Right, thank you, debaters. Okay, so a couple of things are about to come your way. Let me hog the attention a bit more. So for judges on Zoom, I will give you 5 minutes to private message your decisions to me. And the rest of you, I will be starting a poll for you to put in your voice as voters. We have a result. So, yes, I did put in that sound effect just for that joke. So in terms of the poll, we have it very evenly split. However, tilted slightly towards the affirmation due to our in-person vote. So thank you guys for coming in person to vote it. In Zoom, we have 50-50 for the popular vote, which is very evenly split. I don't think we've seen that before. But we did have 2 votes in the audience for the affirmation, so the affirmation was the popular vote. However, we have a bit of a different result among the judges. Among the judges, we have 5-0 for the negation. So a bit of a toss up there. I'm sure you're all very intrigued to know what the judges are thinking. I know I am. So I will go ahead and start with Evan, if you would please explain your decision.
Okay, I hope you guys can hear me. I'm on at home and my AirPods. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so it was a really, really close round for me. I think the rebuttals on both sides were fantastic, but I think Ben's case study of Portugal really dispelled with a lot of the misconceptions about drug legalization or decriminalization. I think having a case study to compare to was absolutely vital in this round, and pointing out like the racial implications, I think like really stuck with me throughout the round. So it was really close, but ultimately it went to the neg.
Thank you, Evan. Next, I will have Christina. If you, let me give you a microphone. If you would please explain your decision.
First off, you both did great. But yeah, so I went with the negation because I thought ultimately your statistics, like your facts, align more to your claims, which were slightly weaker, some were a bit more off. Like I thought the one about the pub being related to drug use was like, it was kind of related, but it wasn't like as close as it could have been, if that makes sense. So yeah, overall, I thought your foundation, your construction speech could have had better supporting evidence. Your rebuttal was great though, but I thought that Ben's constructive and rebuttal were both pretty solid, so ultimately I went.
All right, thank you, Christina. You can just keep the microphone for now. Now I will have Danya, if you would please explain your decision.
Hi, both of you guys had really good arguments. I was actually like still deciding last minute. The reason I voted for neg was because I liked the in the rebuttal, the 3rd point about drug cartels. I think that was what was like bothering me towards, I guess not bothering me, but like kind of like swaying me on either side towards the entire debate. Because when Ben said that, you know, if we make drugs legal, then we won't really have the need for drug cartels. I feel like I was like, wow, like that makes sense. And I think, I mean, both, sorry, you guys both had really good points. So it was really hard to pick one side. I just think the neg did a better job of trying to rebut some of the points. I think one issue I think I had with the neg's arguments was that there was a little bit of, like, I think you focused too much on marijuana. I would have liked to hear a little bit more data on some of the other drugs. And I think the issue with affirmation was that you kept targeting negs like hard drugs policy, like, oh, we're gonna decriminalize, or like, yeah, decriminalize like hard drugs like crack cocaine or something like that. And I think like when neg kept saying like, no, we're just talking about like those drugs that are not that harmful, it kind of is like, okay, well, I don't know if that makes sense. I'm trying.
We thank you, Danya. We appreciate it. Christina, if you would, could you hand the microphone back to Kendall? We will now hear from Kendall. Thank you again, Danya.
Hi, so first of all, very proud of both of you. Both of your sides are very well researched and you know a lot about what we're talking about. I went with negation primarily because when it came down to like the biggest arguments, like how much the government spent on war and drugs, or like the cartel arguments, I found it more feasible to side with negation. So first of all, when it came to like the overall issues that kind of I felt that both of your releases had, was both of you relied much too heavily on data to prove your points, which is totally like data's great, you know, that's where credibility comes from. But the issue with that became like kind of what she said, like it's hard for us to like pinpoint how your data is related to your arguments unless you give a warrant that connects your data to whatever you're saying is going to happen. Like, so for example, the affirmation said that there's 10 million smokers, 20 million alcoholics, only 6 million illegal drug users. Okay, but I need a warrant that explains how availability increases using that statistic. And you could have said, oh, less people will be afraid to try drugs if it's legalized or decriminalized, which would have been a perfectly fine warrant rather than that broad and stand for me to be able to counter on the flow. And I saw that issue on both sides, and the issue is that culminated into like a data argument. Basically, like we had your Italy example, we had a Portugal example, the data points were very much the same, but they argued opposite sides. And when data points conflict, you have to rely on more level replication, but neither of you provided like super strong warrants. When it came to the drug cartel argument, the asked reputation was that they still go to cartels for illegal drugs because it's taxed by the government. And the only example we had for that was California's high taxes, which like results in cartel use. Well, under this resolution, we can have any number of regulations or no regulations on decriminalizing drugs. So like I needed more warranting and evidence to buy that. And then another thing on the negation is you talked a lot about how marijuana and the enforcement of that costs us. And you said like $7.7 billion for which would save us money. That's only about like 3% of the entire federal government's budget. So I needed more explanation about why that impact is super important. But like overall, great job, guys, super well researched.
Thank you, Kendall. Max, if you would please round us out.
So I think Kendall said most things that I would say. Plus, good job, but again, good job, both of you. I found the affirmative to have probably a stronger opening argument, but the way that the negation was able to both rebut the opening argument of the affirmative, but also just bring more information to the table, I thought that was really good. Specifically with the rebuttal of the affirmative, I feel like again, what you said, you just went too hard on the harder, bigger drugs when the statement was like all illicit drugs, right? And I feel like if you were able to connect the marijuana to the higher drugs in a more concrete way, the argument would be stronger in general. And in that sense, I think it's partially the fault of the prompt, like all like when you say all illicit drugs, there's a lot that can go into that, right?
It took us an hour to settle on that prompt. So.
Yeah, exactly. I'd say if it was a more specific prompt, your arguments might have actually won, but just purely because of how much the negation came with information of the light ones that are still illegal, he was able to really push ahead.
All right, well, thank you, Max. And thank you, everybody who came out tonight. If this debate was maybe something of a gateway drug for you into speech and debate, there's plenty of places you can find us after today. We are on Instagram at US Speech and Debate. We also have Facebook, it's US Speech and Debate members, and then we also have US Speech and Debate. And we have a YouTube channel where you will find us later. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you all once again for coming, and I hope you have an incredible evening. Go Gators!